Hi, everyone. We're just going to wait a minute to let people come in. So if you could just hang tight, and if you want, let us know in the chat where you're coming from. All right, welcome everyone to Jane Austen and Company. My name is Anne Ferdig. I am a doctoral candidate at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, as well as the co-director and co-founder of Jane Austen and Company. Jane Austen and Company is a free public humanities series hosted by the Jane Austen Summer Program. Today we welcome our 9th guest in the Staying Home with Jane Austen series. Welcome to Upstairs Downstairs, our conversation with Jo Baker, the author of Longbourn. And as I'm sure I probably don't need to tell you guys, Longbourn is a 2013 novel that gives an alternate view of the events in Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, telling the story not from the perspective of our Bennet sisters, but of the servants at Longbourn, the Bennet family house. So today we're going to have a reading by Jo and a public Q&A. But first, I'm going to hand things over to my co-director, Dr. Inga Brody, who will be introducing Jo for today.
Hello, everyone. It's so excited to see people coming in from Wales and Netherlands and Ireland and Canada and Italy. This is a lovely international gathering. I'm Inga Brody, as Anne mentioned, and I teach at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and I direct the Jane Austen Summer Program, which is the umbrella organization for this and several other events. So we are so delighted to have Jo Baker here with us today. She's the author of 7 novels, most recently The Body Lies from 2019. And her previous book, A Country Road, a Tree, was shortlisted for several things: the American Library in Paris Award, the James Tate Black Award, and Walter Scott Prize, and was a Book of the Year in both The Guardian and The New Statesman. Longbourn, our topic for today, was an international bestseller and has been translated into 22 languages. And this is an exciting tidbit for me, that it is now currently in development as a feature film. Jo is an honorary fellow of Lancaster University and a visiting fellow at Queen's University of Belfast. She was educated at Somerville College, Oxford, and Queen's University, Belfast. And she's married to the Irish playwright and screenwriter Dara Carville, the creator of ITV's The Bay. And they live in Lancaster with their 2 children and a dog.
I would now like to introduce Emily Sparrow, our technical director for Jane Austen and Company, as well as the registrar for the Jane Austen Summer Program, who is going to be helping us with the technical side of tonight's program. Emily will be moderating the audience chat today, so if you're having technical difficulties, she's the one you can reach out to. She's also now going to explain how the Q&A process will work for today.
Thank you, Anne, and thank you to everyone who is joining us for today. I am so excited to see you all here and to hear from Jo. So many of you have already found the chat box at the bottom of the screen. That's fantastic. If you want your message to go to both attendees and the panelists, please be sure to make sure the box is checked that says all panelists and attendees. Now, if you seem to be having technical difficulties on your end and you want to speak to me, please select just all panelists instead, and that way I can see your message a bit more quickly. When it comes time to asking questions for Jo, please direct those to the Q&A box. So this is a separate box from the chat box. We tend to have a lively conversation in the chat box itself. And so if you have specific questions that you don't want to get lost in the chat, go ahead and put them in the Q&A box, and that way Anne and Inga will know to look there for them. Tonight's event will take about 90 minutes, and please hang on to hear more about the Jane Austen summer program when we're done.
Thank you, Emily. For those of you watching, please note that tonight's program will be recorded, and we'll notify you all via our Facebook page and website when it is available to view. If you have to duck out, no problem. You can still leave us a question in the Q&A box, and we'll ask the question to Jo, and then you can tune in afterwards to see her response. So without further ado, we are so happy to welcome Jo here with us. How are you doing today, Jo? How's
I'm
Lancaster?
good, thank you. It's lovely to be here. Really chuffed to be here. Thanks for having me along.
Well, we're thrilled. I think we're going to begin with a reading from Longbourn. Is that right?
Sure. Yeah, I'm just going to give you all a short reading from the beginning of the book. And it's just with an idea of, for those of you who don't know the novel already, for setting up the world of it, a little bit about how it works, because, you know, Austen fans will be able to recognize some of what I'm doing there, and you know, to sort of set up the relationship with Austen's novel. So this is really literally just beginning at the beginning. Though actually for me it's quite interesting. Interestingly, it begins before Austen's novel, but just a little bit. There could be no wearing of clothes without their laundering, just as surely as there could be no going without clothes, not in Hertfordshire anyway, and not in September. Wash day could not be avoided, but the weekly purification of the household's linen was nonetheless a dismal prospect for Sarah. The air was sharp at 4:30 in the morning when she started work. The iron pump handle was cold, and even with her mitts on, her chilblains flared as she heaved the water up from the underground dark and into her waiting pail. A long day to be got through, and this just the very start of it. All else was stillness. Sheep huddled in drifts on the hillside. Birds in the hedgerows were fluffed like thistledown. In the woods, fallen leaves rustled with the passage of a hedgehog. The stream caught starlight and glistened over rocks. Below, in the barn, cows huffed clouds of sweet breath, and in the sty, the sow twitched, her piglets bundled at her belly. Mrs. Hill and her husband, up high in their tiny attic, slept the black, blank sleep of deep fatigue. 2 floors below, in the principal bedchamber, Mr. and Mrs. Bennet were a pair of churchyard humps under the counterpane. The young ladies, all 5 of them sleeping in their beds, were dreaming of whatever it is that young ladies dream. And over it all, icy starlight shone. It shone on the slate roofs and the flagged yard and the necessary house and the shrubbery and the little wilderness off to the side of the lawn, and on the coveys where the pheasants huddled, and on Sarah, one of the 2 Longbourn housemaids, who cranked the pump and filled a bucket and rolled it aside, her palms already sore, and then set another bucket down to fill it too. Over the eastern hills, the sky was fading to a transparent indigo. Sarah, glancing up, hands stuffed into her armpits, her breath clouding the air, dreamed of the wild places beyond the horizon where it was already fully light, and of how, when her day was over, the sun would be shining on other places still, on Barbados and Antigua and Jamaica, where the dark men worked half naked, and on the Americas, where the Indians wore almost no clothes at all, and where there was, consequently, very little in the way of laundry, and how one day she would go there and never have to wash other people's underthings again. So that's just the start of the novel.
That's such a great line too, I think, to end off with.
It's her priority really, it's just cutting down on the manual labor if she possibly can.
So to our viewers out there, you can start putting questions into the Q&A box if you guys would like to have your questions asked to Jo. And Jo, I think this is something probably the first question you probably get a lot is, you know, you spoke before of how organic this novel was for you.
Yeah.
Where exactly did you get the idea to shift this perspective from the Bennet family to the servants in their household? Where did that inspiration come from?
Well, it comes, you know, it's never just the one thing. I think always with novels, there's sort of a layering of circumstance, events, experience, whatever, and then something else drips in, like a catalyst. And for me, for this novel, the existing circumstance, I thought I'd see you better with my glasses off, but actually not. The existing circumstance was being an Austen fan, an absolute fangirl since the age of 12, when my friend Emma, when I met my friend Emma for the first time, we were streamed at school and we put next to each other for almost every class. And she introduced herself saying that she was called Emma after Emma from Emma. And I had no idea what she was talking about. So she introduced me to Austen. So I can date that quite clearly. And I've been rereading Austen ever since. But as a kind of failure of imagination for me, because whilst I loved being in that world, I just loved immersing myself in that world, I knew I didn't quite belong there, because whilst I couldn't really imagine myself in Elizabeth Bennet's shoes, I could imagine myself washing her petticoats, because I knew that my grandmother's generation in my family, she and all her sisters worked in service. So that was what sort of set me up for, that was the sort of circumstance. And then years later as an adult, I was comfort reading Pride and Prejudice with the flu or something. I remember being on the sofa. It's actually this sofa I've got the iPad propped on, because we haven't changed it since, but this was the sofa that I was lying on. With the flu and a duvet, and I was rereading it. I just got stuck on a line, and I can remember sort of stepping outside of the story and looking at the printed smudgy, you know, text on the page. Smudgy because kind of a cheap edition, and it was in the run up to the Netherfield ball. The weather, as you will remember, has been dreadful. It's been raining and raining and raining. The roads are awash. The footpaths are deep in mud. There's no way the Bennet girls are going to leave the house. And the line in Austen is, the very shoe roses for Netherfield were got by proxy. I remember looking at this word and thinking, who is proxy? And beginning to understand that, you know, this was a person, an individual who had to go out in this weather, who's imagined anyway in Austen's novel as going out in this weather to get the shoe roses, which, as I'm sure everybody knows, are the little sort of pom-pommy flowery decorations that go on the tip of your dancing shoes. So when they peep out the toe of your dancing shoes, so they peep out from underneath your dress, they look pretty. So it's an absolute frippery that some poor person has to go and slog out through the mud to go and pick up from Meryton. And so my sympathies engaged with this person, this proxy, and I began to wonder who she might be. And then that began to be identified with Sarah, who is the two housemaids mentioned in Pride and Prejudice, and Sarah is the one who gets a name. So Sarah became my central figure. And the novel span out from that line in Pride and Prejudice.
That's lovely, because we actually, your novel inspired us to do a workshop on shoe roses at one of our summer programs.
Did you make them?
We did.
Did you handcraft them?
We
How
did.
did it turn out?
Oh, pretty well. But it was, it's the other part of that sentence that is intriguing. Too. Yeah. Well, thank you. So we have some questions coming in from our listeners. One person is asking whether you ever tried to do some of these tasks, including the laundry Regency style yourself.
Yes, I did, as part of my research. Not specifically laundry, though. Years and years ago, when my husband and I were first together, we had a tiny flat with no washing machine, and I used to end up doing a lot of laundry by hand that you wouldn't normally choose to. So I did have quite an experience of that kind of hands-on laundry, but not quite the version that they do. I did try the tea leaves thing, which is where you throw tea leaves around and it lays the dust and you sweep it up and it makes the floors much cleaner. My kids thought I was insane. I remember my son, who was, quite small at the time, going, "Mum, you're making it dirtier, lobbing this stuff around the house and sweeping it up." But it works a treat. I haven't tried it on a pale coloured carpet, but I leave that to listeners' own, decision. So I did give a few things a go. I had a friend who made soap, so I talked to her about that. And yeah, some hands-on, some more sort of at a tangent kind of thing. So I sort of tried more modern versions of it. But I mean, at a slight aside from that, I did spend a lot of time as a child. It was a kind of unconscious research for the book in what was a kind of decayed Regency house, a sort of gentleman's house, not fancy, but just a gentleman's house, the biggest house in the hamlet kind of thing. And it became my pattern for Longbourn. It was the vicarage in the village where I grew up. My best friend lived there, not Emma, my best friend before Emma. She was the vicar's daughter, and I used to spend a lot of time just there, and it was sort of neglected and unmodernized. And so it still had lots of the old paraphernalia, the outhouses, the stables, all that kind of thing. So there was a kind of awareness of the sort of domestic spaces as they operated below stairs at that time, just simply from having just been running in and out of that house all that time as a child. Which, it wasn't really, also I get chilblains, I just do. So my empathy with Sarah's cracked hands and sore skin is fairly shallow, really. It's just my own experience of just being prone to those things.
Thank you.
What about, I guess this is a good time to ask about how else you got your information about servants and how they worked or what they wore. What was that process like?
Well, I was quite fortunate in that there's been a sort of steady interest and a sort of gathering interest in this field. So there was quite a lot of gathering had already been done. A couple of scholars had brought out really wonderful books gathering up information about the domestic sphere. Part of the reason I'm stumbling is I'm trying to sum up names, which I should have written down conveniently, but Carolyn Stedman is one, and Amanda Vickery was another. And so I could access some of these documents quite readily that gave you insight into these worlds. Also, I found Austen's letters incredibly useful in terms of minutiae. Servants, the way she spoke about servants from time to time. Messages were passed back and forth via letters between her and Cassandra that included details of their lives, and also included like direct messages to each other's servants. And that's where a considerable amount of that kind of detail came from.
How long would you say it took you to write this novel?
Well, it sort of took me from about age 12 onwards, really, in a way, because it was something that I was saying about running in and out of that house, and being introduced to Austen at 12 and things like that. It's sort of been a novel that's been growing weirdly through my whole life. But when it actually came to sitting down and writing, I think maybe it took a couple of years to write, but it was a very strange process because I was quite happily, I wrote it on an iPad. I'd had a really bad spell where I'd been working far too hard and working all day, and then getting, in our house we used to call it the Sylvia Plath shift, where you'd wake up in the middle of the night and go downstairs to the sofa and just work. Yeah, I'm seeing some nods of recognition amongst the panel. I think it's the curse, it's a sort of academic curse. I was working an academic job and your mind doesn't switch off properly. So I'd write my novel at night and do my academic job during the day. And at the end of that, after a few years, I ended up with really bad RSI. So long story here, sorry, I'm rambling rather, but I wrote Longbourn on an iPad in the corner of a cafe. And to me, there's a nice little echo of Jane there with her, you know, her little table and her notes that she would cover whenever anyone came in. It's a kind of sort of small way of and quiet way of writing. And it was very private and it was very for me. I wanted to write it because I love Austen. I wanted to spend some time in that world, but I didn't quite belong in it. So this was me finding my way to play in that world. That was, I spent about 18 months working like that, perfectly happily, drinking coffee and writing novel and, you know, being no trouble to anybody. And then my husband said to me in November 2012, you do realize that next year it's the 200th anniversary of, and at which point I put my head in my hands and wailed because it was November. And I thought, if I don't get this finished and sort of out, I didn't have a publishing deal, I didn't have a contract or anything like that, but I thought if I don't hit next year, nobody's going to want it the year after, because there's just going to have been a glut of everyone's going to be Austened out, you know, after 2013. Turns out I was wrong about that, but no one's ever Austened out, but I did feel I had to hit that moment. So I spent November through to January writing like a fiend. And I got it to my agent, I think in January, and she started sending it out. So it was kind of, I probably could have spent a lot longer over it if I hadn't had that sudden kick from a sense of imminence that it needed to be done. So weirdly, sort of like a couple of years and a couple of months is kind of how it worked.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was going to say, I don't think there's a such thing as being Austened out, but I might be a little biased in that respect.
No, I was underestimating really, but I just kind of, there were a lot of books came out in the UK. I don't know if they hit the shelves so much in the States, but over here we had a sort of series of tributes, modern reimaginings, which, you know, I think I didn't know that was coming, but there were quite a few. There's quite a lot going on around Austen. But as you say, no, we're not Austened out. We're never Austened out.
And since you mentioned so much that you have such a long relationship with Jane Austen's novels, which one is your favorite book?
Persuasion. And I wouldn't have said that 10, 20 years ago. It was always Pride and Prejudice, but it's definitely Persuasion now. And I think that's because, I mean, I remember the first time I read Persuasion, you know, thinking that Anne Elliot aged, what is she, 27? 25, 27, 27? Mm-hmm. I'm thinking, yeah, no, she is a bit old and on the shelf, isn't she? You know, because you're reading that at 15, you think everyone, you know, over 20 is ancient. And then reading it, you know, rereading it now in adulthood and later in life, you know, it's just heartbreaking. It's just utterly heartbreaking. And, you know, he's got a boat. I mean, what is Pemberley compared with actually getting on a boat and sailing off to see the world? That's amazing. I mean, that's the kind of the potential opening out really for an Austen heroine in a entirely different way, perhaps. So yeah, Persuasion now. It's beautiful.
I was really struck by your opening sentences that spread across the Atlantic so beautifully, and also mentioned the West Indies. One of our listeners is asking whether there were people of color, maybe from Antigua, that were in service, and I suppose associated with that question, why did you choose to spread the umbrella to the West Indies in that opening?
Yeah, well, I wanted to set that up. I wanted to just drip a little bit of that in there at the start, because I mean it's pulling in a lot of things from different directions. It's pulling in from Mansfield Park, where the money, I'm interested in where the money comes from, and that's a class thing. It comes from me coming from a working class background, knowing that my family were in service, knowing about observing the stark inequalities of this world and asking myself, where's the, follow the money. And there's another, so there's the Antigua estates in Mansfield Park. There is a servant mentioned in one of the other households in Austen's letters, who is clearly, from the context, he's black. There's this black guy working near Austen's house when she's in one of the neighborhood families. And we know that this is a relatively common thing, but because it's specifically mentioned in her letters, that gives me another reason to think about this. And then there's another line in Pride and Prejudice where Bingley and his family are being spoken of. And the line is that his family, his father, who got his hand mucky because he was in trade, he's not just inherited his wealth, he was in trade in the north. Now, that means the north of England, and I'm from the north of England, and the town where I live, Lancaster, is an old slave trading port. I feel even uncomfortable even saying it, but, you know, it has to be said. It's a beautiful, as you know, it's a beautiful little Georgian town in parts, but those beautiful Regency buildings were built on the money that came from that trade, the triangular trade, where stuff gets, you know, we export made goods from the factories, from whether it's cloth or chains or guns or whatever, to Africa, and they're traded, and then people are taken across. And that's what trade in the north is, I'm afraid, whether it's Lancaster or Liverpool. I use Lancaster because for me, it has a kind of organic feel. It means something to me. I mean, I know Liverpool a bit, but not in the same way. And also because Lancaster stopped functioning. It's interesting. It's silted up, the port silted up, the ships got bigger, the Lune, our river, got more shallow. And so it stopped being that. So it's kind of preserved in aspect a bit, like in the way that Liverpool just hasn't been. Liverpool has just kept on changing. And so, and a very long answer to a very brief question, the reason I brought those moments in to the opening chapter, the opening phrases, the opening section of the novel, was because I wanted us to notice this isn't happening in isolation. This is happening, this feels like a bubble, but it's not a bubble. It has these international connections. The money can be chased all across the world, and it can be chased into some really dark places. And that's something that I just wanted to weave through the book and notice, because I mean, particularly particularly, I don't think I've seen an Austen novel that adapted, that recognizes, I'm looking at my telly here as if you can see it, yeah, you know, adapted for the screen. I don't think I've seen any sense of different communities, different cultures, but that it's a white world and it's self-contained and it exists in some kind of bubble. I love these adaptations, don't get me wrong, I absolutely adore them. I can rewatch them endlessly, but the world was already more complicated, more various, more rich, more diverse, even in rural England, you know, than we give it credit for, certainly in the way we show Austen on screen hitherto.
Thank you. That's fascinating. I think one of the things that's so wonderful about this adaptation is the way that you do flesh out that world, and you do kind of challenge some of these images of the society of manners. And one of our participants also kind of noted that you seem to be challenging in this novel the idea that servants and especially maids were loyal to their mistresses and masters out of a particular fondness for them. And do you think that's true, that most servants did have a sort of loyalty to the people that they worked for? And where did these ideas come from your own ancestors who were in service?
So am I challenging the idea of loyalty? Were people loyal, and is this my family?
Yeah, so where do these, a lot of questions.
No, it's fine. I'll have a go. I think it's a complicated dynamic, because you have, again, I'm interested in money. I'm really quite, lackadaisical about money in my own life, but I'm interested in the power that's going on in terms of who's got money and who hasn't within the household, who's dependent on whom. There is a power dynamic that works in two directions, really, at least, which is that servants need the employment, but servants can always take their labor elsewhere. That is possible. It's a job of work to do, but you can do it. And in the other direction, there is the intimacy of care. So there's the knowing of secrets, whether that's people's health or their relationships or anything. You can have insight into a world that you don't belong to, you don't inhabit. So there's a very interesting power dynamic there. And I think that can go in all kinds of ways, depending on the characters involved. And I think it's really worth remembering that what we're talking about is individuals, that within, the servant class, everybody's a different person. And the way they respond to their situation, the way they deal with their situation will vary. And so you can end up with a kind of Mrs. Danvers kind of relationship with a housekeeper, or you can end up with something warmer and more maternal, or you can end up with something quite, I think there's a complicated thing. I'm thinking particularly about Mrs. Hill here, because in Longbourn, she is very loyal, but she's also, it's a very complicated and difficult relationship that has played out over years. And I think possibly that's, for me, the most interesting thing is the sense of time passing, long years passed together in this service here, and the way that relationships change over time through that. In terms of my own family, all on my mother's side, all her mother and all her aunts worked in service in various forms when they were young, and after marriage might have stopped and gone on to do different jobs that more could fit around their own households, and some of them continued. And one of them continued. Now, this is, I suppose, sort of slightly about loyalty, though slightly at a tangent, was my great aunt Anne. I didn't know her, she died before I was born, but she was still kind of a presence, because we had all these bits and pieces around the house that she'd been given. So we have some, my mum and dad have, I don't have, but we have some bits of old EPNS silverware and some bits of old crazed china and a few prints that are framed on my parents' dining room. And I thought this was just a sort of sign of, loyalty, relationship, affection between servants and employers. But then my mum said, well, we don't really know that she was given them. She might have nicked these things. She might have stolen them. So the dynamic there, it's kind of hard to unpick. She also her sisters had suggested that, yes, she might have stolen them, or she might have been having an affair with the master. So it's possible that she was getting these things as kind of like, thank you very much, love, have a picture, So yeah, I suppose I hadn't realized it until this question came up, but I suppose I am pulling on some of those sort of threads of my family history to think about the complexities of the dynamics between servants and masters. But I don't like to think, for me, I don't like to think of the idea of blind loyalty towards someone, in that domestic context. I think that's quite a dangerous and problematic thing. I'm sure it happens from time to time, but I don't think it's necessarily, I don't like the idea of that. And I think that's why I only ever watched one episode of Downton Abbey.
One of our viewers had asked whether the Downton Abbey was part of your inspirations. I take it that is not.
No, not at all. I gave it a go. Mm-hmm. And then there was a scene in which some valet was upset because he wasn't being allowed to valet properly because the gentleman was trying to be terribly independent. And I rebel at that idea. I rebel at the idea that like the class has to be stratified, and there are servers and there are the served, and these people deserve to be served and these people deserve to be serving. I find that deeply problematic.
One of our participants in the chat has also given a similar story of the odd spoon, sugar tongs, all things given as gifts we hope. So it seems to be a common family thread.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'm sure there are lots of little bits and pieces in households across the world where they've come from other households. Yeah.
I was struck by your comment about time and the sense of time. And I wondered whether your choice to name to name your novel after Austen's name for the estate had to do with that sense of time as well, and also whether you think Austen herself was she liked these symbolic names, right, that had some literal connections like Donwell Abbey and things like that. So I'm curious, both for you and for Austen, what do you think that name means?
It did feel resonant to me. I did look at it and think, well, that's a name that means something about carrying and endurance. It's Longbourn. What happens here has been long endured. And yeah, but I suppose for her, it's the household, that the dynamic that Elizabeth is coping with. And the tension between Mr. and Mrs. Bennet that she's possibly echoing in that name. But then when I sort of pull it out and stick it on a cover, it begins to mean something about the servants' lives and the servants' carrying of burdens over time. I did feel it was resonant without being too, it's oblique perhaps. It's not too on the nose, but I think it does give a little bit of a sort of a taste of as well as sort of saying it's happening in this house, it's giving a sense of what is happening in the house, I think. So it did feel like a very resonant act of naming to me.
Since the Longbourn family home was not a grand home, like let's say Pemberley, right?
Yeah.
How does that affect the depiction of servants in the book? Would the servants have a poorer background? Would they have been coming from a slightly different class situation than, say, the servants at Pemberley?
I don't know exactly whether they'd be drawn from a different source as such. I think, as I understand it, first of all, in the richer the household, the more male servants you have. They're a sign of, can't find the right word. They indicate wealth because they cost more. You have to pay men more. And then there is a big tax to pay the government on them. Because at the time the government want men to either be fighting in the army or the navy because the Napoleonic Wars are going on, or they want them working on the land. The last thing, affluence, thank you very much. The last thing, I've just run out of words. I've been writing all day, so I've used up all my words. You're lucky I've got any left at all. Where was I? Yeah, so the last thing the government want is grown men standing around wearing white gloves, and serving soup. So there's a policy to try and get men out of the household, but all that does, it has the unintended consequence of making them a sign of affluence and making them a luxury item. So that's something you aspire to, is having as many men as possible. And then the dynamic is different. So the less rich you are, the more likely you are to work alongside your servants, as specifically, as the woman of the house. You will have someone to help you with the laundry, to help you with the sweeping, to help you with the fires, whatever. You would divvy up the tasks between you. and roll up your sleeves and get on with it. And then the more affluent you become, I'm going to keep using that word now because it's a helpful word. The more affluent you become, the bigger the gap becomes between the serving and the served. And there's kind of like little sort of bridge figures who operate within the gap. So you have your, you know, your sort of head butlers and your housekeepers. And they, maybe you draw them from a more sort of lower middle class kind of particularly the housekeeper, slightly faded gentlewoman perhaps. But the dynamic certainly becomes more and more distant the higher up the echelons you go within society. So that by the time you're in the sort of the real sort of in amongst the nobility, as opposed to the small gentry like the Bennet household is, you would, you know, it would be a no eye contact and silence, and just, you know, no engagement whatsoever from servants to their employers. So it does. It's a big range of behaviours, a big range of sort of styles of life and of household management within that. I think probably there is some variety between where you might draw servants from, but I think the key thing is the training they then get within the household, because obviously to go from being a raw recruit to being someone who can, you know, wait on table at Pemberley would be a very different journey to going from being a raw recruit to someone who's just, you know, building fires and sweeping floors in a small gentleman's house. So that would be what would give you the gloss, I think, is the house that you go into rather than where you start from.
I'm not sure whether you've seen the new Emma, the 2020 Emma film.
I don't think who's in it.
Oh gosh, now I'm forgetting.
Anna Taylor-Joy, is that her name?
Yeah, yes, Anna.
Tony Flynn.
Do you know, I haven't seen it. I think it's one of those things I just sort of missed because of, well, yeah, you know, everything that happened. I think you've been on in a sort of normal way, I would have made an effort to go with a friend or two, but just because it's everyone in the household, you know, there's no sort of separate time, is there, anymore? No. So if not everybody in the household wants to watch the new adaptation of Emma, it becomes a bit contentious.
If you do, there's an enhanced emphasis on a greater emphasis on the servants.
Oh, really?
And you may we wanted to get your opinion on it, but
sorry,
maybe we'll get that by email later when you've
just not up to date on this stuff. It's like 2020 has just been such a write-off in a lot of ways like that.
Yeah. Are there any adaptations that you like the depictions of servants, or that you've noticed the depiction at all, or do you feel like they're fairly invisible in most of them?
I think, well, I'm specifically thinking of, there's a couple really. There's the, and again, I'm trying to look at my shelves as if that will help me. But there's a version of Emma, Kate Beckinsale, that one from probably the 90s or early thousands, in which is absolutely heaving with servants. I think possibly more than is realistic. There's in terms of their household, but it does make them very sort of front and center, particularly like at the picnic, the trip to Box Hill. I think there's a lot of manpower associated with that. I don't know if it's a stylistic decision. I thought it was really interesting, but it doesn't feel quite true, but I'm not certain of that. And then sort of conversely, sort of the opposite side of that would be something like Joe Wright's Pride and Prejudice, which does a lovely job of just noticing small moments, like the housemaid. There is a Sarah. She's not quite my Sarah, but you follow her beautifully, singing to herself and carrying, I think either linen or a pitcher of water, I can't quite remember, but carrying a burden up the stairs in the household. So, and I think also, you know, once you are, you know, once for me, obviously, because I'm you know, this stuff is always just ticking away in my brain. I sat down and rewatched, this is what I did over lockdown. It was comfort. It's like comfort eating. We were comfort viewing as well. My son did it for GCSE, and we sat down and watched Pride and Prejudice, the Colin Firth version, and Jennifer Ellie. I'm not sure if that's how you say her name. I've never known. Ely? Thank you. And noticed Mrs. Hill, and noticed, you know, those little moments. But and it's rather, you know, it's rather charmingly done, but it is tiny. But of course it's tiny. They're kind of ghostly presences in Austen's novel.
Speaking of filming, Sarah, we all want to know more about this upcoming film version of your novel, and
yeah,
if you can tell us who's going to be making it and so forth.
Okay, so at the moment it's in development with Studio Canal, who are the wonderful Parisian company, which when they came on board, I was just utterly thrilled. And Monumental Pictures. We have Sarah Maguire attached as director, and a wonderful young playwright, Jessica Swale, has done a draft, and we're sort of waiting on a new draft. So it's been a long wait. You know, it's 7 years now, I think, since the book came out. So I know it does take a good while for these things to happen, and there's been so much happen as well. I mean, things like Brexit. You know, the fact that that's happening has messed up the finances considerably, because it's a sort of it's a European project, and so people get antsy, people get cold feet quite reasonably. And yeah, it's funny to sort of find your little schemes and projects getting sort of caught up in these grand political moments, because, you know, when you write, you kind of think of what you do as being quite quiet and private, and then it becomes something that can't happen because of, you know, Brexit. I mean, it's still just sort of ticking away, and I keep being told, oh yes, it's going to happen this autumn, it's going to happen this autumn, and autumns come and go. So just, you know, I'm just, it's a bonus, you know, if it happens, when it happens, I'll believe it when I'm watching it in the cinema.
Will you have a hand in the actual screenwriting?
Not so far. I've seen versions and given notes, and you know, that I think it's a really difficult relationship to negotiate, like selling your story and letting someone else bring their own imagination to it. But I mean, effectively, it's what I did with Austen's novel. I can't get precious about it. What needs to happen, what everyone needs to happen when a book's adapted, is for these whole other bunch of talented people to come along and do their thing and be imaginative, be playful, be inventive, make it something that's, you know, mine's a novel. If they can bring all their stuff and make it into something for the screen, then, you know, fair play to them. That's just what we need to happen. We need that kind of a further burst of creativity that probably would be very difficult for me to bring to something that for me is kind of more or less finished. I've said what I felt was I needed to say. So just getting there, reimagining it, it would be great to have someone else do that for me, if you see what I mean.
We have another question about process of adaptation, but specifically your process of adaptation. What do you do when you have a situation for your characters based on the events of the novel, but you don't know how servants would typically handle it, or you're trying to kind of fit it within this pre-established world? What's your strategy for handling that?
Well, I suppose there's a couple of things. I have sort of two sets of rules, I suppose, in play at the same time, and they are what Austen has already done. So if I can't fit it within the scheme of what she's already done, then it doesn't earn its place. So, for example, one thing that some readers found problematic about Longbourn is that they felt that I'd given rather short shrift to Elizabeth and Jane and their engagement with the servants. But, and I don't entirely not go there. They do engage, they are kind, they are pleasant, and they are generous. They give her their old dresses, which is the kind of thing that did happen. But I didn't want to I felt it was illegitimate to make Elizabeth, who is our central way into Pride and Prejudice, I didn't want to make her overly focused on Sarah, because that's not in Pride and Prejudice. So it would be wrong to have her sort of like hovering around Sarah going, are you all right, Sarah? Let's sort you out, Sarah. Let's make sure you're fine, Sarah. Because Elizabeth's engaged in this massive, massive love story. So that's what's preoccupying her. And she's, all this stuff is happening off to one side. So for me, Austen's novel can't be tampered with. It exists completely there, and what I do does not affect it, does not affect what is canonical, is Austen. So it has to fit. That's one rule. So whatever the servants do, it has to fit in some way, sometimes by some sleight of hand, but it has to fit. And then alongside that, there's character. So however servants as a kind of amorphous group are supposed to behave, we also have individuals here. These are people. So whether they have to bite their lip or whether they do speak out is a function of both sort of household expectations and etiquette, and the person that they are and the degree to which they have been pushed. And all those things come into play. And I suppose also alongside those rules is the understanding that you arrive at from having looked through, having done the research, basically, of having read the assembled diaries and the letters and the accounts that have been gathered, collated, and are available to us to sort of get a little bit of insight into how these things operated, if that makes sense.
So thinking along the lines of great house and loyalty and service, one of our listeners is asking, what do you think about Mrs. Reynolds from the Pemberley staff?
Yes, I think she's a bit daunting for Sarah, certainly. This is, we were talking about it earlier, the different ways in which households behave depending on, how servants interact with their employers, how it changes as you move up the sort of social scale. And, Longbourn is a gentleman's house, and Netherfield Park is a bit posher, and then Pemberley is just, heaven on earth. But yes, it's a difficult dynamic for Sarah. She's quoted at the, well, no, she's not quoted, but what she's, her insight into Darcy is quoted at the very beginning of Longbourn, that, what praise is more valuable than the praise of an intelligent servant. So we know that she is, she's not to be messed around with, as well as being having fondly engaged with the family there. She is also someone who can clearly run this massive ship very tightly. But for Sarah, it's a very difficult dynamic, coming in from a much more lowly position, not being trained in the ways of a big house, and having an existing relationship with just one member of this household who is herself a newcomer. So yeah, it's a difficult dynamic.
We have a question that calls back to a question we had earlier. Based on your research, was it common or uncommon for there to be romantic relationships between the Black servants and the white servant community? And were prohibitions common in Austen's times as they have been in our recent past?
Oh, what? Sorry? What was the last bit?
The prohibitions against such relationships common in the Regency period as they would have been relatively in our recent past.
Well, there's been quite a lot of research done about this by British historians lately, and it's quite clear that it was a not large but a significant Black community here at the time, and that they stayed and that they married and they had children, and that just by force of the genetic situation, their descendants now are indistinguishable from, they don't know that they've got a Black ancestor. And it's quite fascinating. There's been a series of TV shows about Black history in Britain, and people sort of uncovering this much richer, more complex past than they used to be, having, maybe grown up in Glasgow in a white working class community. Turns out that great-great-great-great-granddad had come from Africa originally via the Caribbean. So it was common. It wasn't a massive community, but it was there. And this did happen, and it wasn't necessarily massively widespread, but it wasn't massively unusual either.
Another train of thought here. One of our listeners is from Italy and read your book in Italian. She asks how you feel knowing that people all over the world have access to it in these different languages.
It's amazing. It's absolutely amazing. And for me, the most astonishing thing is when it's written in a script that you can't read. I can read French pretty well, and I can read a teensy bit of Spanish, but to have the book translated into languages and even scripts that you find impenetrable is utterly extraordinary. And it also is wonderful to be to engage with translators when they ask you questions, they want to unpick things, they get excited about something, maybe some little linguistic quirk you weren't aware of turns up, because the process of translation is a whole other sort of filtration process than any of the copy editing or proofreading that you might do. And yeah, I've just absolutely loved where the book has gone, and also where the book has taken me as well. Touring with it when, around the time it came out, and for a little while afterwards, it was absolutely extraordinary to get to all these different places, and also fascinating the different covers that came up, not just the different, not just the sort of visual translation, as well as the linguistic translation was really interesting.
You don't have an example, do you?
Well, I've got the UK one here, which that's the paperback. I do like to think that that's Jennifer Ely. That looks like her wig for the show. I've got a few. Shall I just bob over and get a few?
It'd be interesting.
Yeah,
Two ticks. Excuse me. Chat amongst yourselves.
Emily, do you want to make the suggestion about Belinda?
Yes, sorry, I just ran off to get my computer charger. I thought I would take advantage of the moment of silence. But yes, I put in the chat that if viewers are interested in reading a depiction of an interracial relationship, they should check out Mariah Edgeworth's Belinda. There is a depiction of an interracial relationship between two servants in the first edition, and I believe that it was cut in the second edition because Edgeworth's father didn't think that it was appropriate for audiences. So there's some really interesting publishing history there that could maybe allow us all to dive a little bit more into the complexities of this question.
Absolutely.
Thank you. All right, Joe, what do we have?
Just the first few that I grabbed. Shamefully, I'm going to have to check what languages some of these are. But they're...
Wow, that's a striking one.
Wow,
yeah,
yeah.
I think that's Spanish.
Yes, it looks like it.
Or is it Portuguese?
Las sombras.
Las sombras, yes, the shadows of Longbourn. So we got the title changed as well.
Mm-hmm.
This is Longbourn House. And
It's Swedish.
obviously this did all matter, and I did all know when it came out. It's not that I don't care, it's just that my memory is not
That's
what
Swedish.
it should be. There we go. Thank you. Yes. I think that might be Finnish.
That's probably Norwegian.
Norwegian? Yeah, could be. I do have a Norwegian friend, and I remember giving her a copy of one of them at the time, which was... oh, there's the French one, which is very sort of cool. Is that glaring too much? Can you see
glaring,
it?
yeah.
Yeah, is that better?
Yes.
Yes.
Un saison à Longbourn. Which I think some French readers actually complained about because it's not a season.
No, it's much longer.
Several seasons.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's just a handful. And there's a Vietnamese one just happening sort of now. There are books on their way to me from Vietnam. But also, I mean, just visually so different. These decisions, the sort of cool white tea service here that is glaring so much, and then this beautiful nape of neck. But they don't like to show faces on book covers because it's
limiting.
Yeah, it sort of closes down the imagination. But here is little Sarah. Sarah's little face in the shadows just turned to one side.
Our Italian friend says that the Italian cover is a woman bearing fruits. So that's another image.
Yes. And I've always loved the American one as well. I think it's absolutely stunning. It was just an utter thrill when that design came through, because sometimes book covers can be a bit of a battle. But that one was just beautiful from word go. They did a lovely job, did not.
So several people are now curious, are you going to branch out to the stories of the servants in other Austen's novels?
Sorry. Not now. I won't say not never, but it's for me it was totally organic. And obviously you could do it with any Victorian novel. You do it with so many different novels. There's a beautiful bit in Middlemarch where Dorothea is sort of divested of her outerwear by these disembodied hands. They take off her bonnet and her cloak and, deal with them. And you could have the household, the Casaubon household. You could go to Mansfield Park. You could go to any of these big households and do this. But I'm very much led by my nose as a writer. I'm always following, I'm on to the next thing. And whilst it might be fun at some point in the future to go and do it again, but I'm not someone who can write to order, and I don't want to replicate a formula, because I think that way the writing gets stale. And for me, it always has to be a passion project for it to keep my interest. And this was just an utter joy to write. I loved writing it. I loved spending time in it. And I think to just sort of go back there for pragmatic reasons would not be healthy, really. But I'm not saying never. I might feel like it at some point in the future. But there are all these, I don't know if other writers have gone there. I don't keep an eye on the, that huge list of Austen spin-offs that exists, but it could well be that other people have gone there and done, I don't know, done any of these big houses. I think the shift, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, just maybe our listeners know if you know of any.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, absolutely. If anyone does, I'd be interested to hear. Yeah. I do think this shift in perspective is just really fascinating. I remember years ago someone asking me this question and saying that I quite fancied writing, looking again at Moby Dick from the whale's point of view. And actually not entirely unserious. I mean, that's not exactly, it's not quite a joke. I am quite interested in that, in terms of, it's always seen as like an account of madness, but actually no, maybe the whale's clearly got an axe to grind. It's not stupid. Anyway, it'd all be vowel sounds. It'd be very easy to write. But I do think that just a little flip of perspective, of just shifting the perspective, and you see everything differently. Seeing Moby Dick from underneath the waves would be a very different novel. Anyway.
Can you tell us what your next writing project will be, or is that still under wraps?
I'm quite giddy about the current one. I don't often get like this. It's not, I can't start telling you what it's not. It's not a lot of things, but it's set during the first 3 months of the Blitz on London. And it's a kind of weird, freaky little detective love story thing going on. And I'm currently, I'm 2/3 the way through the draft, the version that at the end of this draft, I will then send it off to my agent. So no one else has seen it apart from me. My husband's my first reader because, we both write, and he's got a draft to look at, but he's just too busy. He's been inching through it, but he's enjoying it so far, and I've really enjoyed writing it. And I think that's often a clue to whether it's enjoyable to read. If you enjoy writing it, it's a good start. At least I'm not, suffering in the writing. But it's been it's been a pleasure to write, as Longbourn was, and I've just loved the historical stuff. Just the detail. It's a similar process whereby doing sort of the big sweep of fact and event, and then getting into character and plotting and that kind of thing, and then like finding out the little bits and pieces you need to know to make this sing. So how do you make a phone call? What is there in the shops at the moment? What brand would that be? Do aspirins come in tins or bottles? That kind of thing. And I just love that kind of stuff. What's rationed? What isn't? What can you still get? What can't you get? And in a way, I mean, this will be different it'll be similar for, I think, most people watching, like with COVID, with the lockdown experience that we've had, that sense of what is there in the shops. Certainly for us, under the first phase of this, we had runs on the shops, things were no longer available, and you sort of shift into a slightly the sort of austerity wartime kind of mentality, where I'm thinking, yes, well, my daughter needs a new dress, those curtains are looking a bit shabby, that kind of thing. So it was and sort of rationing food, because we can't replace it. If we run out of that, there's no more to be had. So it's sort of writing it under lockdown, it felt like the kind of right thing to be doing. It felt very, as I keep saying, it was a very organic thing that happened, and I really love doing it. So just fingers crossed that it doesn't just all fall apart at the end. I've got another 75 pages to read through, and hopefully I haven't just messed it up for the final third.
Well, what you mentioned earlier, that there might be a series, is it related to that
yeah.
one, or separate?
I've just got really excited by these characters. They're kind of there's a sort of a dynamic between two very different, very damaged characters at the center of it, but I also feel it's quite light on its feet, and it's quite fun. So it's quite dark, but I think it's quite romantic, but it's also quite strange and quite difficult. They're quite difficult people in their different ways. And I just, and I want to, there's quite a number of characters in there, and I want to take these two central characters and then send them in different directions, spend some time over here, spend some time over there, and then maybe go back and bring this other third figure in who's been lurking in the background in the first novel. And I can sort of see this beginning to expand into potentially a series of books that can, you know, the Blitz is only halfway through at this point, you know, if that. So we've got the whole of the war to go. And then, you know, who knows, we can keep going till, you know, now, if she lives long enough.
That's exciting.
Well, it's good to have a project, I think.
Absolutely.
You know, the way things are at the moment, it's good to have something to keep you occupied.
Well, I loved this one review of you in the of Longbourn. I mean, in the New York Times, it was Diane Johnson, I think, and she compared your Longbourn to Charlotte Bronte rewriting Pride and Prejudice with a touch of Les Miserables, and I'm curious whether. What other authors you admire other than Jane Austen? You've expressed your love for her, but what are some of your other inspirations, literary inspirations?
Yeah, I mean, as a child growing up in the north of England, like the Brontes they loomed large. So I love their stuff because it's sort of like the landscape that I, you know, grew up in, and that kind of wildness that you know, is kind of home for me. And I grew up at a time in the UK that was brilliant for children's authors. We had wonderful children's authors. I mean, some who'd already been publishing for a long time, but I used to devour people like Joan Aitken, Leon Garfield. I don't know if you know The Wolves of Willoughby Chase, but that's just like the best adventure story for little girls there ever was written. What else? And then Susan Cooper, who I don't know if any of you have read Susan Cooper. If you haven't, you should. She's just wonderful. She writes this most, it's really, really clever, but really, really light in its feet. It's really engaged in the literary world. It's really got a really interesting moral texture to it. As an adult, I just read voraciously. I went through a big Steinbeck phase. I went through any number of phases where I just fall in love with a writer and just have a complete crush on them and just read everything I could get my hands on. That would include people like Roberto Bolaño, Murakami, Mantell is my current crush. You know, it just and all sorts. But who else do I adored Sarah Waters. That adoration has slightly fallen away. I think her plot, what I admired about her so much was her plotting, her worlds, her research, but also her plotting. I just feel her plotting isn't quite what it was over the past few books. That doesn't mean it won't come back, and it doesn't mean that just because I don't like it doesn't mean that she isn't doing something more interesting. But what I enjoyed so much about the early ones was the kind of clever spiraling plots that really drew you in. And
she's Welsh, isn't she? Isn't she Welsh?
She might be originally. She lives in London, I know.
Oh, okay.
But I don't know where she's from originally. So yeah, that's what I do. I just get little crushes on people and just read everything they write until either they stop or they write something that puts me off. I didn't like IQ 84. Is it IQ 84? I found that a bit problematic, and then I just sort of kind of lost my Murakami vibe from that. So I suppose I'm a bit fickle as well as getting these crushes on people.
Thank you. We might need to write these in a follow-up letter. Go ahead, Anne.
What about Jane Austen adaptation novels? Is that something you read often? Do you have some of those that you enjoy?
I have read a few. And since publishing Longbourn, I get sent them a lot. Whether they're there, you know, there was one about Mary Bennet where they sort of explored her a bit more widely. I thought was rather wonderfully done. And I had read when I was a good bit younger, is it Emma Tennant? Am I right there? Yeah, she wrote a couple of...
the Austen-based detective fiction, I think it is, right?
I'm not sure. It was a Emma in Love, I think is the one I'm thinking of, which follows Emma into marriage, because obviously with Austen, marriage is the end of all stories. And for those of us who got married, you kind of, that it's a tricky area of being an Austen fan and then suddenly realizing she's got nothing to tell you about this bit of your life. You know, how do you deal with this if there's no help from Austen? But I hadn't really explored it very much. I'd got a couple of them more. I think her name is Emma Tennant. There is an Austen detective thing as well. I met the author at an event some years ago, and I did have a go at Death Comes to Pemberley. Some of the ones that were happening at the same time as Longbourn, and Val McDermid's help me here, Northanger Abbey. But it wasn't really a program of reading. I sort of, as a child, explored the Austen novels and the juvenilia, and then sort of came to a halt and wasn't really aware of very much of the other stuff, literally until I typed the title I was thinking of, Longbourn, into Amazon to see what else there might be, thinking maybe somebody had written something, and then there was hundreds. I was astonished. I honestly had no idea that there was so much had been done. Though obviously since then I've met quite a lot of the people who've been writing these things. So yeah, it's quite a rich scene there.
I think I was confusing Stephanie Behrens with Emma.
Right. That's not the one I've met. So there's obviously, there is a lot going on. Yeah. I'm trying to remember. I did an event some years ago at a festival in, doesn't matter where, but I did an event at a festival with someone who was writing Austen prose. Like she was writing in the voice of Austen's novels, which is not something I would myself feel quite comfortable doing, but it was her thing.
Well, do we have time for one more question?
I think probably one more.
Okay. All right, this is a fun one. Would you rather be a servant at Longbourn or Windsor Castle?
This is the kind of question my little girl asked. Would you rather? Yeah. A servant in Longbourn or Windsor Castle? Like the current Windsor Castle? Our dear Queen?
I guess so, yeah.
I'd rather be a servant in Longbourn. I think I'd much rather serve the Bennet household than the current royals. No two ways about it. Also, it's a really lovely part of the world, Meryton. Really lovely parts of the world.
What about Longbourn or Pemberley?
I still think I prefer Longbourn. I mean, Pemberley's beautiful, but you don't really get to. Oh, I don't know. There's probably a bit more life in Pemberley, isn't there? Below stairs, a bit more going on in the servants' hall. I mean, particularly if we're talking about like going in as this is your career and this is you starting out, probably better to go to Pemberley. There's more chance of, meeting Ptolemy or someone like him, rather than just being stuck in that little sort of backwater, as Sarah calls it. It probably would be more exciting, if a bit more austere in some ways. It would probably be quite jovial sometimes below stairs.
Thank you. It's been a lot of fun.
Thank you
so much. This has been a delight, Jo. Thank you for joining us today for us, this evening for you.
Yeah. Still
morning for some of our viewers. But this was just delightful. And thank you everyone out there for joining us. We are hoping to organize more events this year. So if you enjoyed today's program, please follow our Facebook and check your emails, as that's how we'll be talking about any further programs for this year, as well as our series coming out for next year. As always, you can register for our events via our Facebook page, janeaustenandco.org. And if you want to catch up on our previous programs, including our author discussion with Sonali Dev and Sonia Kamal that we did earlier this summer, or some of our fabulous lectures in the Staying Home with Jane Austen series, those are also all available on our website under recorded events.
And if you would like to learn more about Jane Austen, her lives, her afterlives, and read more about adaptations, or rather learn more about adaptations, excuse me, please check out the blog for the Jane Austen Summer Program, which, as we said at the beginning, is the umbrella organization for Jane Austen and Company. The Jane Austen Summer Program is a 4-day symposium that happens each June in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. We bring together Austen scholars, Austen fans, and we examine one of her novels or one aspect of her novels. So in 2021, it will be Jane Austen's World. We have lectures, small discussion groups, a tea, 11s every day, and a Regency ball. So I put the link in the chat and it's up here on the screen as well. We would love for you to give us a follow.
And if you enjoyed today's programming, the 130 or so of you who joined us, please consider making a donation to the Jane Austen Summer Program. If you're in the US, it's tax deductible. And you'll help us fund events like this, and also help us fund teacher scholarships to enable teachers to get training in how to teach older books, which is happening less and less in the US. So that's one of the things that one of our ventures with this Jane Austen Summer Program. And yeah, thank you all so much. And we hope to. We're not sure yet whether we will have more in the Staying Home with Jane Austen series. It depends on funding. But we enjoyed having you here today. Thank you so much, Jo.
Thank you all. And we hope that you all stay healthy and safe during this time. And thank you once again, Jo.
Yeah.
Thank you. It's my pleasure. Thank you, guys. Lovely to see you all.
Good to see you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.